Time to talk about some numbers in FF14. Thanks to Lucky Bancho, who does the census, and their persistent hard work, we can actually see where FF14's success came from. Was it COVID? Was it Asmongold? Was it something else maybe? On the flip side, we also get to see when the game was at its weakest, when it had the fewest players. And you'll probably be as surprised as I was when I found out. We also found something we weren't even looking for. Proof that Yoshi P's MMO philosophy works perfectly. Oh, and the game could actually be about 500,000 players bigger than anyone outside of the dev team actually thinks. So let's get right into it. Lucky Bancho has been scanning the public lodestone profiles in what they call the lodestone census before and after every major patch since all the way back to 2.4. That's a long time ago, almost 8 years maybe. Over the years, the methodology has improved, but it's still like the same thing. It's specifically counting active characters, and that means characters with a different amount of HP, mounts, or minions since the last time they were logged. This includes new characters, who are obviously ones never seen before, and returning characters, which are ones that didn't appear in the last census, but this one and one before, which means they took a break for a while, and then continuing characters, which are ones that are updated in this census and the last one, so they kept playing. With all of these factors combined, we get a whole lot of juicy info to look and a lot of things to chart on graphs and stuff. It does have a pretty large margin of error because they have to specifically exclude free trials, jump potions, and then kind of deal with some other problems. But fundamentally, it's like no free trials, so anyone below 61 and not an NFC don't get counted. There's also alts. There's about, a survey in 2019 said about 20% of players have an alt, so kind of keep that in mind. It's not reflected in the numbers, but kind of keep it in mind. Despite all of those kind of ifs, it is extremely valid for apples to apples comparisons, meaning like, say a census from Shadowbringers versus a census from Endwalker. If it's grown 10%, then the game probably grew 10%, just the numbers maybe not be super accurate. And I hope you like comparisons because we have a hell of a lot to go through. And I mean, like, I barely knew where to start when I was actually looking at this spreadsheet, and I've been staring at it for days, but I finally figured exactly what we should do. Let's retell the juiciest story of all, the meteoric rise of FF14. Did you know that its lowest point, the darkest era, was actually in the middle of Heavensward? Faith in the game was wavering. There's a whole bunch of reasons why, especially like, well, for me, tanking kind of sucked with TP. But for a lot of players, like, raiding was a problem, and it didn't have a lot of the content that people kind of thought, well, whoa, there's so much content. They hadn't made that yet. The result then is basically this graph. We only have a few data points, of course, but each Heavensward patch had a lot fewer active characters as time went on. 3.3 itself actually caused a 20% drop down to, for the first time that we know of, less than 500,000 players. But that's okay, because, you know, expansion to expansion, they'll come back, right? Expansions bring promise. Promise brings players, and Stormblood's a big promise. Except it sort of didn't. At least not right away. The ramp up to Stormblood brought back to almost 600,000, but that's not good news because A Realm Reborn to Heavensward, that jump was 733,000. Something about Heavensward and like the marketing, the positioning of Stormblood genuinely threatened the game because it, you know, if you're not growing, you're dying. So how did that go? Stormblood had a number to beat. Heavensward's launch had 820,000 active characters. That was the goal. Unfortunately, bad news. Only 660,000. So that's 160,000. That's a lot of characters. Didn't show up for the sequel. And this was after Heavensward being, you know, it's Heavensward, critically acclaimed MSQ, incredible story. And in hindsight, this sounds a little insane, but I think at the time people were thinking, maybe this team are one-hit wonders. A Realm Reborn was pretty okay. Heavensward, great. Maybe Stormblood, maybe they didn't like the tone, maybe there's something about it, but it just didn't get the players it needed. So that's a bad start. But the full story comes a couple of months after launch. Players are back, or at least most of them. We're back up to 800k, and that's not bigger than Heavensward, which would be your goal, but it is progress. And I think it went like this. I think people weren't excited for Stormblood, but then people sat down and played it, and then told their friends, dude, come on, Stormblood's great, come on, play. So maybe that was it, maybe it was like a little bit of distrust that went away, but generally speaking, based on these numbers, Stormblood fared better on retention than Heavensward, but as you can see, not massively. Yoshi P actually admitted this himself to Famitsu in an interview, saying that those two expansions had players fall and quit. They left because they weren't satisfied with the game in the middle of leveling, or they finished MSQ and went, fuck it, I'll come back in the next MSQ, but they didn't have a reason to stay and play. And that's where their strategy of continually growing the game, continually improving like the core game, seems to have panned out, because after Stormblood, we all know what's next. The first 3 Census in Shadowbringers had 46% more characters than those in Stormblood. It broke and then held a 1 million player average, well, character average, and you can see why. The last few Stormblood patches, the story that they're building up, stuff like the Gimlet Dark, the content quality was really coming, they really stepped into their own. And then Shadowbringers marketing, it just feels right. You watch the trailer, you become the Warrior of Darkness, even though that kind of didn't mean anything, it was exciting. The trailer was honestly beautiful. And of course, it was an explosive success right at the gate. 30% higher on most metrics than Stormblood and Heavensward combined. You just need to look at these numbers for the proof. Shadowbringers was like 30% higher on most metrics than Stormblood and Heavensward. It was just retention, bang. New players, bang, everything. I mean, obviously, the MSQ was called the best JRPG story in a decade, and it's accurate. Every new bit of content was just good, and something about the whole thing, the whole process, whole product just clicked. And in that interview where Yoshi P admitted that players didn't stick, he said Shadowbringers was different. It actually grew from month to month. It grew after, instead of people going, MSQ, done, I'm out. It actually clicked and people stuck around. Interestingly, in the same interview, he added a lot of validity to all of the numbers we're talking about, Bancho's count, by saying that they broke the 1 million mark around the same time that Bancho said they did. So Shadowbringers, resounding success. Where did they go from here? What's next on the step of the massive rise? Usually you would say, okay, it's the next expansion, surely. But we have a few little stops to make on the way first. Would you believe me if I said 5.3 was actually a really, really bad patch by the data? It was one of the strongest story patches in the game. It was genuinely fantastic in content. Everything was wonderful. But it was genuinely one of the worst. Because it saw a 22% drop in active characters and a 74% drop in new characters. But that's because 5.2 came first, and they were already up 45% and 218%. The real story? COVID turned 5.2 into an absolute monster of a patch. This is where the first explosion on... You see all the graphs, you see everything we've been showing you so far. The big explosions? COVID. Shadowbringers started the fire. COVID was a fuel tank thrown into it. 5.2 had brought 1.25 million active characters, which is obviously a new record. 314,000 new characters. I guess everyone in Japan was just playing it. And then even lapsed players returned, 270,000 of them. Effectively, a second Shadowbringers launch, which was already massive. And I think we all know it gets a little bit better from there. Guess which data point came after Asmongold started playing the game? No, not the biggest one. The little one before that. The one that started that climb. This point was about 2 weeks after he first played, which is right in between 5.5 and Endwalker. And the massive one, the next one, is a combination of Asmongold's ongoing influence and Endwalker hype, which coalesced in 560,000 new characters showing up. That's over 500,000 new characters, and it doesn't include free trials. It doesn't include those kind of weird ones, the boosters, doesn't include those. So God knows what the real number is. Actually, we might know, because they announced 22 million registered accounts in April, Square Enix that is, and then they announced 25 million in December, which means obviously there's a couple months before Asmongold's influence happened, but that whole process, the whole, the internet falling in love with FF14, that was 3 million new accounts. So Asmongold, probably about 2 million of those. Now surely, this is the peak. No, not even close. The wave that started with COVID and Asmongold just refused to stop. Over the first 3 points of Endwalker, it's almost averaging 1.5 million characters and hit a peak of 1.7 million in April. Compared to the first 3 of Shadowbringers, which were explosive, it's got over 41% more. And it actually shows little signs of slowing down as well. You look at the new players for the past couple of reports, and it's averaged out as like 380,000 since July. That's a lot of new blood. And it's also smashing its own records for player retention too. It's not like players are cycling out. Of those 1.7 million like characters in the peak, 1.1 million of them were continuing playing from January. That's what happens when your MMO has content. That's what happens when your live service game has content, and it's good content. Players are likely to stick around. And that's kind of the story by numbers, but we also have a couple of other little fun things we can kind of figure out from all of this data. The first is MSQ clear rates. They're really, really low. Bancho added this stat in Stormblood and then kind of added more in Shadowbringers, but you get to see how many players, or how many characters, started the expansion. And then how many characters finished the expansion. And look at this graph, it's crazy. You see this big spike? That's 1.5 million characters at the end of Shadowbringers. But only 1 million of them had cleared Shadowbringers like 5.0. Only 880,000 of them cleared 5.3. That means less than half the active player base was actually caught up with the game. And if you look back at the percentages, that tracks. The percentage of players who clear the expansion never gets above 75%. It actually dropped as low as like 42% and 44% at Endwalker and Shadowbringers launch. There's been only 1 million players have actually started Endwalker, despite there being like over 2 million playing. That's kind of crazy. And I think that means the game's like really quite healthy. It means that players who are, well, I mean, one of two things. Either players who join dip out, which is fine for them if they don't want to play. No point wasting their time. But also it means all of that new blood's coming in and they're slowly burning their way through this MSQ. They're not like boosting, they're not jumping through, they're not skipping to the end. They're actually taking their time. And to put that into a little bit of perspective, if you've finished Endwalker, you're within 53% of the active players. 47% haven't played it. 47% haven't finished it. And that's a lot of players. That's a lot of nihilism left to be experienced. That's a lot of suffering left. There's also the retention stuff to talk about. Because Yoshi P, says the freedom to leave whenever you want and the freedom to come back is kind of what is a healthy player base, a healthy relationship. And he's right. And it shows in his game. You see this returning number, right? Over Stormblood and Shadowbringers, around 15% of players who are active were actually ones who previously took a break and then came back in. And that makes, 15% all the time means you're going to cycle through a lot of your players fairly quickly. And I think that means that that's going to be a healthy player base. And this is only from Bancho's numbers, which are taken like every, before and after a patch. So there could be even more ebb and flow in the middle and we wouldn't know. But I think that's honestly great news and kind of proves that the holding your players hostage isn't actually a good solution to having player retention. Although I think there's a lot of video games right now kind of feel that way. You know those hidden players, the hidden players I talked about earlier? There's 500,000 of them and they're behind the Great Wall in China. Yeah, FF14 is actually handled by a different company over there, so a lot of this is obtuse. But Lucky Bancho noticed that in last August, the Chinese version of the live letter, they celebrated 10,000 players got Cerberus, the mount, from Delubrum Savage. But mount data is public, right? So Bancho went and found out that, assuming that the Chinese play a little bit like the Japanese, which means a higher portion of them doing raid content, well, Japan have got about 2% of their characters have that mount. So if if 10,000 is 2% of the Chinese populace, that means there's 500,000 players in China, which means that, you look at that 1.7 mil from Endwalker, that's actually probably 2.2. And that was before a little bit of growth. And before Endwalker, that was in the middle of kind of Shadowbringers. So realistically, there could be about 2.5 million active characters. Maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but they're almost certainly more than 2 million characters, which, there's maybe a 20% drop off for alts, and then you cycle in free trials and you kind of cycle in a little bit of kind of missed data. Honestly, there's probably about 2 million people playing the game, which, isn't absolutely massive, but that's big. And it's a lot bigger than it was a couple years ago. So if you're interested in what a quick takeaway version of this is, just kind of, here's the bite-sized information. Number one is that FF14 is healthier than ever before. Every single number, that's active players, new players, players who take breaks, and players who don't take breaks, God help you, almost all higher than at any point in the game's history. And then you look at what's coming next, you look at 6.2, and it's really hard to imagine a major fall-off happening. I really feel like the game is only going to grow from here on out. We're looking at like up to 1.8, maybe 2 million active characters, including China. And that doesn't include the free trials. Or, the characters below 61 with no FC. That could be a lot of players, paying players as well. Number two is the growth. Obviously, you say COVID did it, Asmongold did it, Endwalker did it. But those are, I think, the equivalent of like an oil truck driving into a fire. The fire was already there, and I think that fire was all of the hard work that they put into, obviously they put into Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers, but it's building your game additively, right? It's building your game additively so you get more and more content the more you develop, instead of running like the seasonal model like a lot of games do and cutting old content out. But there's also the fact that they went and said, okay, the old way we do like the core game doesn't work. The removal of TP, the combat changes, the system changes that really work, stuff like that it's really been super important to the growth of the game. And I think it's like the blueprint for anyone else to look at, because, you see in the numbers, there are results. 3, FF14 has never actually been in danger. Its lowest point was in 2016 with just under 500,000 characters, and it's been above that and growing since. It's not massive, but it's still millions of dollars a month in revenue. So the game's, never even nearly dead. Number 4, the game has really been cycling players, and that's really healthy. It's been cycling new players and returning players, which means players will never grow stagnant and quit for good. They'll always come back. 5, lots and lots of players have a lot of MSQ content left. And if they have a lot of MSQ left to do, think about how much else they have to do. There's a crazy amount of content in the game, and half the players haven't done the MSQ. Half the active players, so that doesn't include free trials. Anyway, I'm rambling on a bit here. If you enjoyed this, let me know, and I'll maybe take another couple days of staring at the spreadsheet and see if I can figure anything else interesting out, or tell another story that, find another story in the data. But it was fascinating to find out just how huge Shadowbringers was as a jump, because I'd have thought it was like, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers. No, Heavensward, Stormblood, Shadowbringers. Incredible. And honestly, the game's been bigger than I think anyone's given it credit for. I heard an anecdote that I can't really share, but I heard that like people in the know in the industry know and have known for years to watch for FF14. Apparently that's true, and you can completely see why. I think just before I go, thank you to Lucky Bancho, because obviously without your data, this complete video wouldn't have been possible. This spreadsheet wouldn't have made sense or existed. And I hope they keep doing what they're doing. But thank you very much. And obviously, thank you very much for watching. And we will see you very, very soon with more.